Journalists, on the other hand, shouldn't have what you called a glass jaw when it comes to some of these investigations, citing the First Amendment and threats to the First Amendment.
Well, the First Amendment is a critically important part of the Constitution. It is not unconditional.
Tom Brokaw turned 86 this year, a milestone that has quietly settled over one of American television's last living monuments. He is one of the few remaining links to a version of network news that no longer exists, an era of 3 networks, 1 evening broadcast, and anchors whose faces were as familiar as family. Across the same NBC hallways he once commanded, Savannah Guthrie now sits behind the Today Show desk, having spent more than a decade building a very different kind of career, one built as much on relatability and resilience as on authority. There is no verified public record of Brokaw commenting directly on Guthrie's tenure. The two have not, as far as public reporting shows, weighed in on each other in this way. But their two careers, set side by side, tell a real and well-documented story about how American broadcast journalism has changed in the space of one generation, and about the very different kinds of pressure each of them has had to withstand to get where they are. To understand what Brokaw represents, it helps to go back to where he started. He was born in 1940 in Webster, South Dakota, and grew up in small towns across the state during the years after World War II. He got his start in local radio and television news in South Dakota and later Omaha, working his way through small markets the way most broadcasters of his generation did, long before satellite trucks and digital editing made instant reporting possible. By the late 1960s, he had moved into national television, first with NBC's Los Angeles affiliate, and then into the network's Washington bureau, covering the Watergate scandal as one of the reporters who helped bring the story to a national audience. Brokaw became a co-anchor of the Today Show in 1976, a role that, decades later, would connect his career to Guthrie's in an odd historical loop. He left Today in 1981 to become the sole anchor of NBC Nightly News the following year, a chair he would hold for 22 years. During that run, he became part of what is often called the Big Three of American network news anchors, alongside Peter Jennings at ABC and Dan Rather at CBS. Together, the three men presided over the last era in which the evening newscasts functioned as something close to a shared national experience. A time before cable news fragmented audiences and long before the internet fragmented them further. The signature moment of Brokaw's career came in November 1989, when he anchored NBC's live coverage of the fall of the Berlin Wall from Germany, one of the first American anchors on the scene as East German border guards let crowds pass through. It became one of the defining images of his career, the anchor who did not just read about history from behind a New York desk but stood inside it as it happened. The rivalry between the Big Three anchors was, by most accounts from that era, intense and closely watched inside the industry, even if it rarely showed on air. Nightly newscasts on ABC, CBS, and NBC competed for ratings within a margin of a single household share, and a strong night for one network's evening news could shift advertising revenue in ways that mattered enormously to the executives above the anchors. Brokaw, Jennings, and Rather each cultivated a distinct on-air identity within that competition. Jennings, the internationally seasoned foreign correspondent, Rather the intense Texan with a reporter's instincts, and Brokaw, the plain-spoken Midwesterner whose South Dakota roots gave him a folksy authority that played well with a national audience stretching well beyond the coasts. Brokaw covered the Vietnam War and later reported on the Watergate hearings from Washington in the early 1970s, experience that shaped the reporting instincts he carried into the anchor chair years later. By the time he formally took over nightly news in 1982, he had already spent close to 2 decades building the kind of on-the-ground reporting credibility that, in that era, was considered a prerequisite for sitting behind the anchor desk. Brokaw was also an author, and his 1998 book, The Greatest Generation, profiling Americans who came of age during the Great Depression and fought in World War II, became a #1 New York Times bestseller and gave the label Greatest Generation its permanent place in the American vocabulary. He followed it with several more books on the same theme and on his own life. He stepped down as anchor of NBC Nightly News in December 2004, handing the chair to Brian Williams, and moved into a role as a special correspondent, continuing to produce documentaries and long-form reporting for NBC News for years afterward. He formally retired from NBC in early 2021, closing out a relationship with the network that had spanned more than 5 decades. In the summer of 2013, Brokaw's story took an unplanned turn. At 73 years old, He began experiencing persistent back pain and was eventually diagnosed at the Mayo Clinic with multiple myeloma, an incurable cancer of the plasma cells in the bone marrow. He kept the diagnosis largely private at first, continuing to work on documentaries while undergoing chemotherapy and other treatment before the news became public. 2 years later, in 2015, Brokaw published A Lucky Life Interrupted, a memoir of hope, a New York Times bestseller in which he wrote candidly about the diagnosis and its aftermath, the back pain that would not resolve, the blood tests that revealed the malignancy, and the long process of chemotherapy that followed. He wrote about relying heavily on his wife, Meredith, and their 3 daughters, including Jennifer, a physician who helped manage his care. He also described the disorientation of having built a career on being the calm, authoritative voice explaining the world to others, only to find himself, in his own words, feeling less like the person in control and more like a passenger in his own treatment. Brokaw has continued to speak publicly about his diagnosis in the years since, including appearances with the Multiple Myeloma Research Foundation, where he has described the diagnosis as something that gave him what he called a kind of rebirth, pushing him to use his profile to raise awareness about the disease and to advocate for making treatment more affordable and accessible. More than a decade after his diagnosis, he continues to manage the disease, which remains treatable but not curable. The illness marked one of the only times in Brokaw's public life that the composed, authoritative voice of God persona he had built over decades gave way to something more openly vulnerable. A shift that, as it happens, mirrors a broader change in how television news figures of the current generation, Guthrie among them, have chosen to present themselves. Savannah Guthrie's path to national television looked almost nothing like Brokaw's. She was born in Melbourne, Australia, in 1971, while her father was working there as a mining engineer, and the family returned to the United States when she was 2, settling in Tucson, Arizona. She earned a bachelor's degree in journalism from the University of Arizona in 1993 and spent several years working as a reporter at local television stations in Missouri, Arizona, and Washington, D.C., including coverage of the September 11th attacks and the anthrax mailings that followed shortly after. In the early 2000s, Guthrie made an unusual career pivot. She left television to attend law school full-time at Georgetown University Law Center, graduating magna cum laude in 2002 and posting the highest score on that year's Arizona bar exam. She practiced law briefly at the Washington firm akin Gump-Strauss-Hauer and Feld, focusing on white-collar defense work, before deciding to return to journalism, this time armed with a legal background that would become central to her reporting identity. Guthrie has described the decision to leave television for law school as a genuine gamble at the time, telling Georgetown's own publications years later that she was not at all certain the pivot would pay off and that she was, in effect, walking away from a career she had already spent nearly a decade building. That willingness to restart from a position of uncertainty became something of a through line in her later reporting, particularly once she began covering trials for a living. Her interviewing style has often been described by colleagues and critics alike as more prosecutorial than conversational, a product of years spent thinking about how to build and dismantle an argument rather than simply how to ask a question. She joined Court TV in 2004 as a national correspondent, covering high-profile trials including those of Martha Stewart and Michael Jackson, work that put her legal training to direct use covering courtroom proceedings for a national television audience. She later moved to NBC News in 2007, where she served as a legal correspondent before becoming the network's White House correspondent from 2008 to 2011, covering the presidential campaign of that period and reporting on major stories including the killing of Osama bin Laden. She also co-anchored MSNBC's The Daily Rundown during part of this period, a role that further established her as a serious political and legal reporter well before she became a fixture of morning television. Guthrie joined the Today Show as co-host of its third hour in June 2011, and just over a year later, in June 2012, NBC promoted her to co-anchor of the show's main broadcast, replacing and Curry alongside Matt Lauer. She has remained a lead anchor of the program since. Beyond her Today duties, she has served as NBC News chief legal correspondent and has anchored the network's election coverage, and she has interviewed a long list of major political figures, including multiple U.S. presidents, foreign heads of state, and cabinet officials. In 2023, Georgetown University Law Center awarded her an honorary doctorate of law in recognition of her reporting on legal affairs. The defining crisis of Guthrie's tenure at Today came in November 2017, when NBC fired her longtime co-anchor Matt Lauer following allegations of sexual misconduct, a story that broke with almost no warning and reshaped the show overnight. Guthrie was the one who delivered the news to viewers live on air, visibly shaken, telling the audience that she and her colleagues were still absorbing the news themselves. In the days and weeks that followed, she and co-anchor Hoda Kotb, who had stepped into Lauer's role, had to hold the broadcast together while NBC News faced intense public scrutiny over what executives had known about Lauer's conduct and when. The episode became a turning point for Guthrie's public identity. Rather than retreating behind a scripted, composed delivery, she chose to be candid on air about how unsettling the situation was, a decision that stood in contrast to an older broadcasting tradition, one that Brokaw himself came up through, in which anchors were generally expected to project composure regardless of what was happening around them. The choice resonated with audiences and helped stabilize the broadcast during one of the most turbulent periods in today's history. Guthrie has also been unusually open, by the standards of network anchors, about her personal life. She has spoken publicly about the difficulty of building a family later in life, describing her path to motherhood as one that involved fertility treatment before the births of her 2 children, daughter Vale and son Charlie, with her husband, communications consultant Michael Feldman, whom she married in 2014. In November 2019, Guthrie suffered a serious eye injury when her then 2-year-old son Charlie accidentally struck her in the right eye with the sharp edge of a toy train. The impact tore her retina and left her with significant vision loss in the eye, forcing her off the air for several days while she underwent a series of laser procedures aimed at avoiding full surgery. She spoke about the injury candidly on Today, describing how she had lost vision in the eye within about 24 hours of the accident and how doctors were working to seal the tear before it could worsen into a full retinal detachment. The injury required a longer recovery than initially expected. In December 2019, she underwent surgery to repair the retinal detachment. Complications related to that procedure led to a cataract, which she had removed in a follow-up surgery in July 2020, a process further delayed by the COVID-19 pandemic. She underwent at least one more minor procedure in early 2021 connected to the same injury, describing it publicly as, she hoped, the last one. Throughout the ordeal, which stretched across more than a year, Guthrie discussed her recovery on air in detail, including the frustration of blurred vision and the emotional relief when her sight began to return. Brokaw's career unfolded in an environment where a small number of network anchors functioned as gatekeepers for national information, delivering the news once a day to audiences who had few alternative sources. That model rewarded a particular kind of on-air presence, authoritative, restrained, largely unemotional. Brokaw, along with Jennings and Rather, built reputations on the idea that they were, above all, trustworthy narrators of events, not participants in them. The environment Guthrie has spent her career in looks almost nothing like that. Cable news, social media, and a fractured, always-on information ecosystem have replaced the old 3-network model, and morning shows like Today now operate as a hybrid of hard news, lifestyle programming, and personality-driven television, all competing for attention against an endless stream of other sources. Anchors in this environment are expected to be transparent about their personal lives in a way that would have been unusual, even discouraged, during Brokaw's run at nightly news. Guthrie's willingness to discuss the Lauer fallout, her fertility journey, and her eye injury on air reflects that shift. Audiences today respond to visible authenticity in a way earlier audiences were not necessarily asked to expect from their anchors. That does not mean Brokaw's era was without its own vulnerabilities, or that Guthrie's era is without its own discipline. Brokaw's decision to write publicly about his cancer diagnosis, discussing the physical toll of chemotherapy and his reliance on his family, was itself a departure from the more guarded posture that had defined his decades at the anchor desk. And Guthrie's legal background gives her interviewing style a rigor that echoes an older tradition of hard-nosed, fact-first reporting, even as she operates within a more personality-forward format. Both, in their own ways, represent adaptations to the demands of their particular moment in the industry. Brokaw, now 86, lives largely out of the public eye, continuing to manage his multiple myeloma more than a decade after his diagnosis while occasionally appearing at events connected to cancer research and advocacy. His body of work, from his war zone reporting in the 1970s to his coverage of the Berlin Wall's fall to The Greatest Generation, remains a fixture of how the second half of the 20th century is remembered on American television. Guthrie, meanwhile, continues to co-anchor today, now well into her second decade in the role, having become one of the most recognizable figures in American morning television. Her run has spanned a network scandal, a pandemic, a serious personal injury, and a fundamental transformation in how news is consumed, and she has remained at the desk through all of it. The two anchors represent, in a very real sense, two different chapters of the same institution, NBC News, separated by a technological and cultural shift so large that it is difficult to overstate. When Brokaw took the nightly news chair in 1982, there was no way for a viewer to talk back to him, no comment section, no clip that could be shared out of context to a global audience within minutes of airing. When Guthrie sits down at the Today desk each morning, she does so knowing that nearly everything she says will be dissected, screenshotted, and redistributed across platforms Brokaw never had to think about, by an audience that expects to see her as a person rather than simply hear her as a voice of institutional authority. That shift has not made either era's version of the job easier, just different. Brokaw's generation of anchors had to earn trust largely through consistency and restraint, appearing each night with the same measured tone regardless of what had happened that day, in an industry that offered its top figures very little room for public missteps. Guthrie's generation has had to earn trust through something closer to transparency, allowing audiences to see the uncertainty, the fear, and occasionally the physical toll of the job in ways that would once have been considered unprofessional. Both approaches have produced anchors who lasted, in Brokaw's case, more than 2 decades in a single chair, and in Guthrie's case, well over a decade and counting. Whether or not either has ever publicly reflected on the other's career, their two stories, read together, offer a clear picture of how much the job of the American television anchor has changed, and how much has stayed the same. The demand for credibility, the toll the work takes on the people who do it, and the audience's need for someone steady to tell them what happened, whatever form that steadiness takes. Brokaw proved that steadiness could look like restraint. Guthrie has spent more than a decade proving it can also look like honesty.